If you have not taken a gander at the miniatures from Grimcoven yet, I'm here to tell you, there is a lot going on with these miniatures. To the extent where I don't even know where to start painting some of these sculpts. But I came up with a plan. I want to reduce the complexity of the paint scheme for these miniatures while painting them quickly and still ending up with a great looking miniature. So that's what we're looking to accomplish today. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. The Gunslinger isn't the most complex miniature from this game, but it's what I'm using to demonstrate the planned approach for painting all of the miniatures for Grimcoven. And honestly, I chose this character because he's one of the few prototype miniatures that I have for this game. The plan is to paint 2/3 of the miniature in an overly simplified manner and spend quality time on only about 1/3 of the miniature. I'll have 3 imagined light sources for these models. A moonlight glow on the back, a red bounce light from below near the front, and natural light coming from above the miniature off to one side. I begin by preparing the miniature with midnight blue paint and primer in one. I have yet to find a hobby primer that is this dark a blue. I've tried Color Forge Tempest Blue, but it's a bit too light for my taste. Since this primer has a satin finish, I sometimes spray it with a clear matte varnish before proceeding. This is to give it a little more texture for the acrylic paint to adhere. For this particular miniature, the natural light will be coming from the model's upper right. This small area of the miniature is where we'll spend most of our time painting precisely. Much of the backside of the miniature will be painted with a moonlight glow. The midnight blue spray paint serves as the base for the blue OSL as well as a shadow color for the rest of the model. Finally, I'll have a red bounce light coming from below off to the model's left. This red OSL will be visible from the model's front. I'm using Vallejo Azure through an airbrush to lay in bright spots for the moonlit highlights. I'm choosing to spray from an angle that is above the rear of the miniature and slightly to the left. I'm applying this very faintly because I don't want to obscure too much of the dark blue shadow color. I'm mostly doing this as a guide to inform me where the moonlight should be hitting the model. Dry brushing with a white acrylic paint is a fine option here, and one that I've used many times before. The key when dry brushing for OSL is to dry brush from the direction of the light source. So for this moonlight, I'd want to direct my brush strokes from top down. This way, the white paint will catch on any edges that the light would hit. Whether dry brushing or airbrushing, I begin with a light touch and then intensify these highlights with a standard brush later. The red glow is going to cover a little less real estate than the moonlight, but it's just as important to speeding up the overall painting process. I'm spraying this from below the miniature and slightly off to the model's left. I want the edge of this glow to be visible on the model when it's viewed from the front. And just to be clear, I'm considering the front of this miniature to be the right profile when viewed at this angle, not the direction the gunslinger is pointing his firearm. Painting OSL on your models has another advantage besides just speeding up the process. When painting a character that is made up mostly of muted colors, this is an easy way to introduce a splash of color without undermining the character's vibe. In other words, I'm adding red to the piece without painting the character in a way that doesn't make sense. A red external glow that affects the character is much different than giving the gunslinger a red trench coat, for example. The OSL adds color to the character without it being viewed as part of the character's aesthetic. I hope I'm making sense with this. Now I use titanium white to pick out the brightest points of the red OSL. It's easiest to take care of the white highlights for the blue and red areas at the same time, but here I'll demonstrate each separately. I'm making small highlights within the existing red layer, focusing mostly on edge highlights. These brighter highlights will be larger near the base of the model since this is from where the light is emanating. As I move up the miniature, the bright highlights will either get smaller or there will be no highlights at all. For example, I'm not placing any of the white highlights on the face or bandana. After all of the white is in place, I follow up with the brightest red that I own. I'm using Pyrrole Red for this. Something like Scarlet Blood Game Color or Bold Pyrrole Red Pro Acryl work great for this. As I apply the red, I don't just cover directly over the white area. I'm stretching this bright red beyond the white border to blend it more naturally with the surrounding darker red area. I didn't use a dark red color for the base layer, but since I applied it thinly through an airbrush, it appears darker than if I were to paint a more substantial layer with it. The dark blue primer is affecting the initial red layer, making it seem darker. Once this bright red is painted over the white, it appears that we have a nice red glow under our mini. I'm using two methods to increase the opacity of the highlights on the rear of the gunslinger. First, I'm attacking it with a quick dry brush to highlight most of the edges and bits that are sticking out. I'm not concerned with being overly precise with highlights since this is the back of the miniature. I want to give the impression that moonlight is hitting the rear of the Mini, but I don't expect anyone to scrutinize the backside of this guy too closely. Once I'm happy with the coverage of the dry brushed highlights, I switch to a standard brush to further define them. I need to do more than simply increase the opacity of the edge highlights. I also need to create new highlights on some of the smooth features where the dry brush failed to deposit enough paint. This is particularly effective on the flowing folds of the trench coat and on the brim of the hat. The final step for this moonlight glow is to glaze a dark blue over the white highlights. I prefer to use phthalo blue for this, but any deep blue will do. For this glaze, I absolutely want to thin the paint down quite a bit. Any dark blue has the potential to be very opaque, especially when using a hobby paint with opacifiers in it. It's much easier to apply a second coat of deep blue over these highlights than it is to completely obliterate them and have to start over with the white. So now we have painted 2/3 of this miniature with a simple application of two colors. All that's left to do is paint the small remaining areas with a color palette of dark tans and light browns. This dual OSL paint up is a general idea that I'm going to use on every miniature for Grimcoven. I'll paint the rest of the miniature in a way that suits the specific miniature that I'm working on. This way, each miniature is painted uniquely and is easy to differentiate on the table. While I intend to paint this guy with a muted color palette, I still need to ensure that I have a point of interest that draws the viewer's attention to a singular focal point. Typically, this would be the miniature's face, but this miniature doesn't really have an easily visible face. I'll have to choose another location for the brightest highlights. Right now, I'm leaning toward focusing on the bandana around the gunslinger's neck and the brim of the hat. I'll still use desaturated colors such as yellow ochre and leather brown for these highlights, but I'll need to make them bright. I want to be careful not to have the blue and red OSL areas become the main visual draw. I painted those areas fairly quickly and didn't put in much effort there, so I fear they won't pass close inspection. I would prefer to have the viewer's attention pulled toward the area where I'm spending the most effort. Naturally, this relies on me choosing the right approach. Even when mapping out the areas left to paint with dark shadow colors, such as this German camo black-brown, I want to leave some of the midnight blue primer showing in the deep recesses. Black-brown is an outstanding shadow color in its own right, but midnight blue is the universal shadow color for this particular piece. Having a small amount of midnight blue showing in all of the deepest shadow areas will make the piece look more uniform. It should help make it appear as though all parts of the miniature are being affected by the same environment. I'm using the Army Painter Leather Brown for all of the leather components of the gunslinger's outfit. I want large jumps in hue for these pieces. I'm using this to both highlight these areas and scratch in some texture. I want the leather to look quite old and worn. To achieve this, I'm avoiding smooth color transitions. This layer will appear as damage as well as inconsistent highlights. Going against my usual game plan, I'm using titanium white to brighten the leather brown. I always feel that adding white to brown paint desaturates it too much, causing it to look unappealing. But desaturation is the name of the game with this piece. This game has a very dark and morbid atmosphere that I want to embrace with this paint up. I don't dare call it grimdark because I do not want to trigger the grimdark gatekeepers. That's a battle that I am not yet ready to fight. A few accent items get a coat of mummy robe. This isn't a thorough coat of paint because I want some of the previous brown layers to show through a little. For the fastest face painting in the history of painting faces, I apply a single swipe of orange-brown. And yeah, we're done painting the face. I do spend a little more time on this neck scarf bandana thing that is hanging around the gunslinger's neck. Since the face isn't visible, I'm going to paint the area surrounding the head as the brightest points. This includes the hat and the left glove, but mostly I'm putting my efforts into this scarf thing. I begin with ochre brown and proceed to yellow ochre, and finally ice yellow to ensure that it's the brightest feature of the miniature. With each color layer, I paint texture with short lines and stippling. With each lighter shade of paint, I focus more and more on the folds and creases that are affected by the light source. I imagine light to be coming from the model's upper right, so that's where I focus the highlights. Finally, we just need to paint the firearm. This gets a broad edge highlight of wolf gray. I follow that up with a fine edge highlight of glacier blue. This was a pretty fun little paint up, and I know I'm going to thoroughly enjoy painting the rest of the miniatures for this game. I would like to thank my amazing channel members for supporting the effort that I put into making videos like this. You too can support me by becoming a channel member using the link below. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of gunslingers.